Alrighty. Hello, everyone. Welcome to our little virtual event space here. I'm Allie. If you're local, you might recognize me from our Lake Forest Park location. And I am so excited to be introducing three wonderful speakers tonight here to discuss cybersecurity and Cory Doctorow's new novel, Attack Surface. So before I pass you off to them, I just want to quickly thank you guys all so much for tuning in and for buying the book. Your guys' support really is what keeps this place going, and we really love what we do. So we appreciate you guys so much buying books and showing up. You guys will all be receiving signed copies of Attack Surface. Those books have been signed and are on their way to us now, and we'll ship them out to you as soon as we receive them. So thanks so much for your patience on that. And you will have your hands on them soon. We will be posting links to in the chat to Cory's other books as well. So meanwhile, I definitely recommend checking out the website for some of our other upcoming events, or sign up for the newsletter. It's a weekly update about events and exciting releases. And of course, you can always follow us on social media. We're on all of the major social media platforms at Third Place Books. You'll have the quickest updates, blog posts, book recommendations, everything you could hope for. So we're going to be here for about an hour, and towards the end, we're going to take questions. So if you have any questions, which we very much hope you do, go ahead and throw them up in the Q&A box, and we will get through as many as we can. So without further ado, New York Times bestselling author Cory Doctorow is a science fiction writer, journalist, and technology activist. He has been nominated for Hugo and Nebula Awards, holds an honorary doctorate in computer science, has written novels, picture books, graphic novels, and nonfiction, and is a regular contributor to The Guardian, Locus, and many other publications. Tonight, we're here to discuss his new novel, Attack Surface, which is an adult standalone sequel to Little Brother, in which a counterterrorism programmer has made hacks to allow repressive regimes to spy on dissidents and manipulate their movements. In discussion tonight are Snyder, computer security expert and co-author of Threat Modeling, a standard manual on application security, who has worked as top security officer at Apple, Fastly, Intel, and is currently chief security officer at Square, and Runa Sandvik, who works on digital security for journalists. She has worked at the New York Times Freedom of the Press Foundation and the Tor Project, and is a board member of the Norwegian Online News Association, and according to her Twitter description, has hacked a sniper rifle. So that is enough from me. I'm going to turn you guys all over to them for a discussion on cybersecurity in 2020, when so much of our lives exist online.
Thank you very much. Thanks, Allie. Welcome to everyone who's joining us tonight. And those of you in Seattle, thank you for supporting your great independent bookstore, Third Place. I have done many events at Third Place, all the way back to the first Little Brother book. And I think for every book I've done since, with the exception of this one, which obviously I'm staying here for that one, but still managing to get to Third Place in this very remote way. And I'm very, very pleased to be joined tonight by Window and Runa. It is an absolute honor and delight, two of the security experts I admire most in the world. And I do have quite a large acquaintance of them. So that's really saying something when if I can pick a couple of favorites. Don't tell the other ones, they'll be sad. The plan tonight is I'm going to read briefly from Attack Surface. And then I have some questions to start us off, and that will turn into a conversation. And then about quarter to the hour, we're going to take your questions. And then we're going to try and finish up as close to the hour as possible. I know everyone books, 4 or 5 Zoom optional meetings after a day's work and really wants to get to those. That's what I like to do. And I'm sure you're champing at the bit. And if you've heard that joke at the other ones of these events, my apologies. This is the last one. I have run out of jokes. So the scene I'm going to read tonight is a very brief one. But I think that it sets up our discussion tonight well, It's a scene in which the protagonist, a woman named Masha Maximow, who's a security expert who has spent most of her career as a surveillance contractor, first for the DHS, then for some Beltway bandits in Iraq, and then finally working just as a straight up cyber mercenary attacking pro democracy movements in the former Soviet Union, who's moved back to California. In part because her childhood best friend is being targeted by the same cyber weapons that she's been developing all her career, and this is her revelation of just how bad things are for her friend. And I think that it embodies what people have enjoyed about the Little Brother series, which is that it draws on real, if experimental, technologies that are out there in the field for both surveillance and countermeasure. And in this case, it draws on a thing that two researchers, Bunny Huang and Edward Snowden, prototyped called the introspection engine. When I woke up, my heart was thundering and I didn't know why. Something had scared me out of a deep, deep sleep, and for a second, the feeling was so intense that I couldn't even think clearly enough to remember where I was. Tanisha's blinds were drawn, and the room was in half light, and I could hear Tanisha's muffled music through her bedroom door. I took a couple of breaths and oriented myself. Full bladder, dark room, sore muscles, crusty eyes, shitty taste in my mouth, and my phone in my hand. It made a noise, not a loud one, but not a good one. One I'd chosen myself as a very specific alarm tone to sound in a very specific set of circumstances. It was a phased loop of European ambulance sound, distinctly computer generated, with some menacing clipping to give it the ear feel of being played super loud, even at low volumes. My phone had only made that noise 3 times before, and all 3 times it had been because I'd gotten too close to gear that I'd set up for Zoth. That's her previous employer. Technically, the alarm wasn't coming from my phone. It was coming from my phone's case, a battery case that gave me an extra day's battery life, but which also had its own onboard processor, which had a small wired SIM-shaped tentacle that had inserted into my phone's SIM cage. The actual SIM lived in a slot in the case, and that slot was powered by a little programmable controller that monitored all the signals going in and out of my phone. If my phone was supposed to be off but was covertly sending data, I'd hear that alarm. But that wasn't the only trigger. The case also let me know when the phone tried to connect to a fake cellular tower, an IMSI catcher. Stock phones could spoof their IMSIs when they thought they were talking to a fake tower. But with the case, I could just log and ignore any attempts by a fake tower to handshake to my phone. Finally, my case would let me know if the tower it was connected to tried to poison my baseband radio, the tiny, low-powered computer that handled all the communications between the phone's cellular radio and its operating system. Baseband radio security sucked, and anyone who took over the baseband radio would be in a permanent blind spot that the operating system and its apps could never see into. So that's the little brief reading. It's one of the nerdier bits of the novel. And I, as I say, I think it sets up our discussion well. Window and I were chatting earlier on Twitter, and she pointed out that the questions that I was planning to ask both her and Runa were almost the same considered in the round. And that itself is a chewy point, because the questions I was going to ask were to Window, what do people get wrong? And to Runa, what's the difference between defending against nation state actors and trolls or hackers for hire? And Window, you had a really good insight there about what people do get wrong about security and how that relates. So I wondered if you could explain that for us.
Sure. I think the question of what do you get wrong about security, or about OPSEC, which is originally how you had phrased it, is not building your mitigations specific to the threats that you're concerned about. So the way you'd go about defending against internet trolls in terms of personal security versus nation state actors is entirely different, and making sure that you're deploying your resources appropriately, or acknowledging what you can't mitigate, is pretty well wrapped up in understanding what kind of resources you're up against.
Thank you very much. And Runa, I wondered if you could explain, like in a kind of practical way, what you do to armor people who are being attacked by nation states, by some of the people who work for them as cyber mercenaries. We had for the first one of these, Ron Diebert talking with us at the Strand, and he told the story of going after an SO group and being targeted both digitally and physically with ex-Mossad agents who came after them for reverse engineering and publishing on their weapons. Do you have stories about that you feel like are particularly good exemplars of what's at stake and how it works?
Let's see if I can come up with a good one. I mean, in the work that I've done to date, be it either as a freelancer or working for the New York Times and sort of like an established media org and a very large newsroom, you do sort of run the gamut in terms of the challenges that you face or that you deal with, whether it's someone needs help sending an encrypted email, someone needs help setting up Signal on their phone, someone is traveling to Moscow or to Beijing, someone's communicating with Snowden, for example. And so like for each of those different cases, you do have to like figure out, well, what is risk in this case? If it's someone traveling to China, at that point, we would be talking about nation state actors versus if it's someone reporting on the alt-right, it could be that they're running more of a risk of online threats and harassment and doxing, for example. So just trying to figure out, like for each of those specific cases, depending on the person, depending on the country they're going to, depending on the story that they're working on, trying to figure out to win those points, what do you do with the time that you have and the tools that you have available to you so that you can focus on the right tools at the right time for the right project and not miss the mark.
So I've known people who've worked for large companies who went to China, for example, with burner laptops that they literally just recycled when they got home. They just weren't used again. Is this overkill? Are there ways that you can carry equipment through extremely adversarial environments and still rely on it after the fact?
You can carry a device, keep it with you all the time, and hope that will keep it safe. But if it's a phone, you have to worry about a baseband attack from a cell tower when you're there. That phone is going to be compromised, and you're never going to be able to trust it again. If you keep your laptop with you, you don't have to worry about someone getting to it while you're in the hotel, but you've connected it to networks there. And so you've got the same problem. You've got all this, in addition to the operating system, the attack surface of one of these devices is much larger than you expect. You've got the operating system, which is quite robust. You've got all the apps that you're using. And then you've got all of these hardware components in your device have firmware as well. And as Cory described in the excerpt that he read, you can compromise the firmware in a lot of these components and sit there forever, uninspectable, and you'll never know that there was a problem there. And some of these are, let's say, exposed through local attacks that you have to be within reach of the radio, or that you've got to be on the same network. But I would say that if you physically carry it there, never let it out of your sight, never connect it to a network, maybe, but I'm not sure it's going to be super useful.
Wow. So in light of all of that, I wonder about the role of technology in protest, because it's been such a hotly debated issue. I know human rights workers like Patrick Ball from the Human Rights Data Analysis Group, who's quite big on Facebook. He says, when I'm trying to figure out the extent of the Guatemalan genocide for a human rights trial, for a war crimes trial, I want to be able to reach people, and Facebook is where they are. And I know other activists who say the only role for Facebook in a justice struggle is to teach people not to use Facebook. Given the kind of impossibility of security from that focused continuous threat that you've just described, where do you see the role of tech and security and justice struggles? Do we just go to wheat paste posters and I don't know, thumb drives that we pass from hand to hand, or is there a way that we can make digital technology a part of a movement for a more just society, where maybe you don't have to fear that people will be installing baseband radio, poisoning malware in the cellular network and that sort of thing?
Well, to Runa's point earlier, it really depends on what you're trying to do. If you need to communicate a message, and that's more important than the possibility of the message being intercepted, then you communicate the message. You're constantly doing a trade-off between the value of either the communication or the access or being able to participate versus what does it mean to have your communications either intercepted or have your communications interfered with. So yeah, it really depends on what you're trying to do. The question of do you participate in Facebook? And if that's where the folks that you're trying to reach are, yeah, absolutely, you participate in Facebook and you accept that this is not a platform that is where you can feel confident that your messages aren't going to be inspected by parties in a position to either compromise or use legitimate means to do the equivalent of a subpoena in their jurisdiction to collect information.
Runa, did you have any thoughts on this?
I mean, I completely agree that if people are already on Facebook, if that is where the discussion is taking place, if that is where your audience is, I think that you, to some extent, do have to participate on that platform. But then to Windows' point, you do have the ability to choose how much you participate in and just how you go about using the platform. And I will also add that there are other options out there. For example, we have the Signal app, which collects very, very little metadata around your communications versus something like Telegram or Facebook Messenger or WeChat, to use that as an example. So like in terms of like a mobile app and a messenger, you do have a choice in terms of which app you use. Similarly, within tech and other platforms, we do have a choice. It's just a matter of then, are you willing to make that choice and perhaps go use a platform that not a whole lot of other people are using at this point in time.
Yeah, I wondered, you touch on this idea that you've got to talk to the other people, and this strikes me as kind of the weak link in all of these security discussions. I think probably tonight dialed in is my friend Ken Snyder, who has been my network administrator for a long time and used to be the CTO of Wikimedia and runs a box in Toronto at 151 Front Street with my mail server on it. And my mail is encrypted and I pop it so it doesn't stay on the server. It's just on my laptop. There isn't a cloud copy of it, and it's very secure, and I use GPG, and everyone I communicate with uses Gmail and just leaves their end of the conversation in the clear on Google servers. And I think that convincing other people to not compromise your security has been an issue that has been of extreme moment in this COVID era, where we've been trying to talk to people about what it means, where your choices impact other people. And we've seen how hard that is in a public health context where there's like an immediate high profile threat. Have you had any luck with conveying the urgency to the people that you're in contact with of thinking not about their own security, but of the security they communicate with, and taking measures to make everyone's communications more private?
Yes, but only in a very specific context. So I think what you're touching on is sort of like, how do we teach people about something that is important to us? It may not be important to them. And so one option is to then find a way to tell a story in which they understand what this means for them, not just what it means for you. Like, we're all selfish human beings. Like, we want to do the thing that we enjoy, that we want, that is going to do us a favor. So if I am not getting anything out of using the specific app, and if I don't understand why this app is so important to you, I am not going to go ahead and use it. So in a lot of the security awareness work that I've done, it's sort of all been about figuring out for the audience that you're facing, what kind of story can you tell, what kind of examples can you give to make your point relevant? The way that you would talk to, say, the investigations desk at the New York Times about security is very different than the way you talk to obituaries, for example. different skill levels, different experiences, different stories that they're working on. Like, not everyone is going to have a source like Snowden, so not everyone's going to necessarily need the security measures that you would put in place, right?
Did anyone that you can talk about ever try to attack the obituaries desk? I find that to be like, now I want to write a novel about someone who attacks an obituaries desk.
No, just me through phishing exercises.
Oh, excellent. We have a fake Cindy Cohen, who's the executive director of EFF, who periodically tries to phish us in phishing exercises. Every now and again, we'll hear from fake Cindy. Window, how about you? I mean, I understand there's no open sesame, but have there ever been moments where you felt like you really nailed it, or where you've gone back and thought, gosh, I wish I'd had a better way to convey the urgency here?
No, I'm kind of coming from the opposite take here, and whether it's in business or it's in personal investment in security, it needs to be appropriate to the risk. And so there are conversations I only have in person, and there's a lot of tolerating exposure in my world, whether that's the amount that's appropriate for the business to invest in these kinds of security mechanisms, or whether it's what I can expect other people to do in terms of on their end protecting our communication. I have conversations that I don't think are especially interesting, and the amount of work required, and I used to make a bigger investment than I do now, the amount of work required in order to maintain the kind of, let's say, reduced attack surface that you described for your mail server, Cory, is not a great investment for me right now. So if I'm worried about, let's say, organized crime or internet trolls, or folks on the internet, encrypted email and Gmail, it's sufficient to my security requirements. If I'm worried about nation state actors, I can't mitigate that threat, and so I'm tolerating that risk because there's a limit to what I can do. And on the other end of things, I might ask somebody, especially if we're communicating over a mechanism that's let's say still in the clear, or has had compromises in the recent past. I might say something like, hey, can you delete that so that it's available to them, but that it's not like logged forever, so whoever compromises their account like a year from now doesn't get my conversation with them as collateral damage. But that's the extent that I'm willing to go to, because for the most part, we have to live our lives. We want to communicate with our family and friends. I'm on Facebook. Mostly I use it to communicate with my kids' school. Like, that's the community, right? Like, if I want to communicate with that community, then I have to be on Facebook to do it. And that's okay for me. I'm not, there are some conversations I only have in person, but I try to give folks, say, a lot of space, because it's nobody wants to be the admin for their alarm clock, right? The kind of work you have to do in order to secure all the attack surface in your world is ridiculous, and it's inappropriate. This is actually one of the reasons I went to Apple, because I thought, hey, if anyone was going to feel invested in trying to make high quality security accessible from a management perspective, not necessarily from a price perspective, it was going to be Apple. Apple would be willing to make it easy, and I think for the most part they really have. But the amount of work that I used to do in order to mitigate my risk included things like, I had the logs on my server sent to a dot matrix printer, not all of them, just certain logs, a dot matrix printer that I would hear, and that would be also like, there would be a physical copy of it, so you can't go back and edit the logs when they're physically printed out, right? And I would like launch myself out of bed to go inspect the device. Like, if I heard my hard drive spin up at 2 o'clock in the morning, I would launch myself out of bed to go like see what's going on. I don't do that anymore, and I don't care, right? Because the set of things that I'm worried about are either I'm tolerating this risk, and there's not much I can do, or there's not much I'm willing to do in terms of how it changes my lifestyle, or over here it's kind of like, I've done what I can, and at some point you just have to live your life, and the kind of communication that I have is sufficiently protected by the effort that I've made.
There's a scene in The Cuckoo's Egg you just reminded me of, Cliff Stoll's memoir of fighting these East German hackers who'd infiltrated the US government through the servers that he managed at the University of California, where he realizes that the server is tapped and that if he forks the login to a file, that they'll see it. And so he physically connects a line printer to it. So that just instead of going to a terminal, it's going to a line printer, and he can just see the stuff that's coming off it. It's that I love that that image. And your meeting in person reminded me, I've worked remote for the Electronic Frontier Foundation since the early 2000s. And I needed to have a very sensitive conversation with a colleague once. And I was back at our new office in the Tenderloin in San Francisco. And I said, where can we go to talk that is, private? And they said, well, we can go up on the roof. It's very good. And it's got a nice view. So we go up on the roof, and they said, but you have to be careful of the bees. And I said, what bees? And they said, well, we had an urban beekeeper cold call us and ask if they could put a hive on the roof. And I'm like, that's where the microphones are, right? Except of course the sound of the bees would drown it out. So is there a thing, and by a thing I want to mean it very broadly, including how you assess what the thing should be. What is the thing that a person should do when they sit down and confront the possibility that there is a lot of sensitive information about themselves and processes that involve their lives that pass through their hands, whose security they're not aware of, and that they want to take stock of and improve? Is there a kind of sit yourself down, think about the risks, mitigate the risks, and here's how you go about it? Or do you hire a professional, or do you give up?
I think it depends on what you're trying to protect against, right? So, for example, if we're just talking about just the most mundane stuff, right? Before you post that photo on social media that has an image of your friend, right? Consider whether or not exposing that person's location is going to be a problem, right? Maybe they've got an abusive partner that they are trying to avoid, or maybe they've got some situation in their world where you are compromising something about them, and whether it's taking a picture of the inside of someone else's house because you happen to be at a party at their house and then posting them on social media, you are compromising that person's privacy. Just asking first, like, hey, is it okay if I post these photos? Like, it's barely an inconvenience, and it makes a huge difference in protecting other folks' privacy and security. Like that, there are a lot of mundane stuff. And then, speaking as a person who's feeling really comfortable in my existence right now, I'm sitting in the Netherlands for what it's worth. So I'm not some activist on the front lines under an oppressive regime who is worried that they're under surveillance because of their political activity. And for the folks who really are worried about being targeted to that degree, this is probably not the right place to get the best information on security. There's great content on, for example, the Committee for Protecting Journalists site. I think it's pretty, they have some pretty concrete steps. But even just getting to the place where you're, say, not communicating sensitive information over an encrypted forms is a good start. Instead of sending a text message, you can send a message in Signal. That text message is almost certainly being analyzed. Probably no one's actually looking at it, but some algorithm somewhere is. So even just going that far for almost everybody is like 80 or 90% of the way there. And then the set of folks who have different requirements, this is probably not the right place to give your information. And there are folks to help you, who really want to help you stay secure.
I'm just answering a question in the chat here. It was the Committee to Protect Journalists. So Runa, Window raises a really good point, which is that it all depends on what you want to protect against. But I think a lot of people start with, I don't know what I need to protect against. And if you don't know how to assess what the risks are, how do you start having a sensible thought process that doesn't start with, well, maybe the government of China will decide to target me or something, and instead looks at a really good range of risks that are ranked in the likelihood that you'll face them.
I would then suggest, instead of thinking about who might be coming after you, which is sort of a very, very dark thought, flip it around and instead look at how much of me, of my life, my identity, my network, my photos are available online. How much can any random person figure out about me in an hour, for example? Start there and Google yourself and see what you find, and then see if that is something that you're comfortable with. Like, how does that leave you feeling? Are you okay with the things that show up? Are there things you wish you could secure or lock down, or maybe remove in some cases? If you want to go one step further from there, you can sort of look at the social media accounts that you have, and you can either secure them with unique passwords and two-factor authentication, or maybe you decide that actually I haven't used this Google Plus account since Google Plus was launched, so maybe I can just close this down, right? And just start to take stock of your online life and your online interactions, and just how many accounts you have, and who you share your data with, and go from there. And I do want to add, like, this is not something that you can just do on a Saturday, right? It's not something that you just sit down and just do in 5 minutes. It is a process. It is like a longer term work. You can take an hour on a weekend, and then maybe you take 2 hours next weekend, and maybe you don't do anything for a month, and then you sit down and you just sort of workshop it out on a Saturday. I think it's more important to make this something that is sustainable and doable for you with the time that you have, rather than something you have to like squash in today.
For reasons I don't even recall, when we moved back to America in 2015, I set up a Google alert for my name and address. I think that some database had popped up with it. And about a month later, I found that there was a data aggregator who had gone to the Port of Los Angeles and copied down all the public way bills of everything being shipped in, which, because it was our stuff being shipped from London, included our passport numbers. And they had sold this on to data brokers, and that our home address and our passport numbers were now linked to our names in about 50 different databases that existed to market to people who might buy shipping services. And I never did get it removed. We eventually moved and my passport expired, but that data is still there. It was good to know, if nothing else, because when we shipped the rest of our goods over from the UK, we took some countermeasures specifically to address that risk, which I think I had never even anticipated. So a lot of this stuff, when we talk about it, we talk about what individuals can do. And I hear in your tone a certain weariness about asking individuals to take this on board. And from my perspective, I often think that the problems here are mostly that our policymakers and the companies that dominate our technology have failed to step up, leaving us with lots of individuals having to take individual steps. And I wondered if you had thoughts about what firms or lawmakers or regulators could do that, Window, you said, well, if you're using Signal and doing a few other things, you're 90% of the way there. Is there a thing, an omission on the part of firms, on the part of states, that if it were corrected, would get us a substantial way there towards a world where we're at less daily risk digitally?
I think that the question of whether or not we could provide some sort of backdoor into encryption for law enforcement without undermining the security of encryption keeps coming back up. And I'd say the overwhelming advice would be to actually listen to the security experts, actually listen to cryptographers when they tell you, no, you can't. And if you undermine it, if you create a backdoor, then that backdoor is there, and you might not be the only party to use it. And it's not a lack of willingness, although I'm sure there's a lack of willingness, but it's also, we've been telling you the same thing for decades, like 3 decades minimum, that I know this is something that is desperately desired, but if you make it insecure, then it's insecure for everybody.
Yeah, I think Mike Masnick calls that the nerd harder fallacy. You know, I don't know how to make a backdoor that only works for good guys. Just nerd harder. You'll get there. I believe in you. I have faith. Oh, I like that. That's great. Runa, how about you? Policymakers, states, corporations, what could we do?
I would say, like, at the top of my wish list would be make it easier for me to control the information that I have stored with you. So, for example, I have friends who automatically delete all of their tweets and Facebook posts like once every 30 days or something like that. But the challenge there is that, like, if you try to delete a DM on Twitter, you can leave the conversation and you can delete the conversation from your direct message view, but that conversation still exists for the other party, and it still exists on Twitter servers. You can go into the conversation and for you, delete every single message you have sent. That's a very manual process. It would be so much nicer if I could do that whenever I wanted to and not be beholden to tech companies in that way.
Yeah, I mean, normally around this time in a book's life cycle, I would be getting in a fart tube every day and going to a hotel and doing some stuff, and often crossing borders. On this tour, I was meant to be in Canada, the US, the UK, and India. And part of my border crossing protocol is deleting all the DMs off of my mobile devices so that I can unlock my device. You know, I'm not worried about Twitter in that instance. I'm just worried. I just want to be able to hand someone an unlocked device and not feel compromised. And you're right. I think that the message app that comes, the SMS app that comes with Android lets you multiple select and delete, and so does Signal. But Twitter DMs don't, Hangouts don't. There's so many messaging tools where you just have to tap each one, hold on it, tap delete, tap OK, and then do it. And if it's been a while and you've got 1,000 of them, then it's an all-day project to delete those DMs. It's crazy. Are there things that about the landscape of technology and security that excite or scare you? Do you worry about quantum encryption? Are you excited about new models for usability represented by Signal? Is there anything on the horizon that you think would be really cool or really frightening if it were to ripen?
I think one of the things that I'm really excited about is really boring, and that is every platform that abstracts away security decisions from most developers. I think that, for example, moving encryption so that it's done in the operating system, or the primitives are implemented in hardware, or not implemented by every single developer. Once upon a time, every server implemented their own connection encryption independently. We had a bazillion of these libraries, and I think over time we've built up the confidence around a handful of these, and we've got the right kind of folks working on those sorts of things. But as we get to some of these other security components that are also critical, getting to a place where you can leverage the security functionality from the operating system or from the platform that you're developing to, and have it not be something that you have to implement yourself, because it's hard to do right. It's easy to do wrong. You won't know that it's got implementation problems. This is like memory corruption issues. So buffer overflows, et cetera. You can move to a higher level programming language and completely mitigate memory corruption issues. So as folks move to these higher level languages, we're reducing the attack surface for those kinds of issues. And I think this is a trend in general in security, in application security, and in security development. And it's taking a really long time, but that is the general trend. I think ultimately it makes it easier for folks to build more resilient software, and that is exciting to me.
That's awesome. What about the problems where those underlying libraries or tools have longstanding defects that, because they're assumed to be good, they don't get discovered for a long time? I'm thinking specifically of Heartbleed, and just the wake-up call that we had one day where we realized that the stuff that was 20 years old, just no one had looked hard at it for a while, and there were some really big bugs in it. It was really widely deployed.
Yeah, absolutely. That happens. And the set of technologies that we incorporate into our products in our environments and our systems is a lot, and it's complex, and it's all interdependent. And it's a lot of technology that we can't sufficiently mitigate as a single deployment or as a technology consumer. And no, you can't trust that it is secure, but you can trust that the integrity is getting better over time for these security functions, because they're not being implemented by folks who have no experience in security implementation.
Right.
Yeah, that is still a huge problem, and it is growing complexity. But the opportunities for making these kinds of mistakes get narrower and narrower. Nothing is ever going to be secure. You will always have these kinds of problems, even within an operating system. The amount of attack surface or opportunity for a security vulnerability to impact you, it's actually pretty significant, but it's smaller than it used to be. And that's the trend that I'm excited about.
That's cool. I once saw a presentation from a woman from the University of Indiana's Internet Civil Engineering Task Force, and they were like a small unit at the computer science department that would look for critical pieces of internet infrastructure where the number of committers to the code base was like under 2. And they would go in and refactor this stuff and find grad students to rewrite it. And their first one was NTP, which had been used. It's this, you know, piece of utility software used to synchronize the clocks, and it had been used by for really ghastly attacks. And there was only one committer, I think, and he ran the code repository on a BitLocker repo that he had lost the root password for a decade before and hadn't patched in a decade. And then BitLocker's license made it really hard to get the source code out of. And it was such an eye-opening talk, because it revealed how much of the core stuff that we rely on was really just very brittle, and actually also how easy it was to make it robust. That, you know, 5 or 6 grad students looking for a grad project sat down, reduced the code base by 30%, increased the number of committers, you know, got it moved it off of a server that no one had a root password for, and really made it work. Runa, how about you? Things that excite you, things that terrify you?
I want to say, like, more in terms of what scares me, just sort of something that I've been thinking about for the past couple of days, is that we in the physical world, it seems like we know and we are very aware of steps that we can take to have more privacy. We have curtains, we have doors, we have locks, and we've had that for a long time, right? But within the cybersecurity space and sort of the online space, we're still talking about the rise of cyber attacks and the increase in ransomware and the increase in hijacked social media accounts. But it's not like we haven't also talked about how you can avoid those things for a long period of time as well. So, you know, at what point do we stop talking about the increase in something that's sort of been fairly common for a decade, and start actually pushing the solutions that we know work, which are sort of the online equivalent to doors and locks?
Yeah, that's a good one. For me, I think the thing that scares me is the extent to which people who are unsophisticated attackers have access to very sophisticated attacks. And you mentioned ransomware, and for me, that's the big one. I was once actually, when I got my first U.S. work visa, I flew to Seattle, rented a car, drove to Vancouver, and came back across to get my visa. And I parked in a parking garage in Gastown, which was at that point the like epicenter of the heroin epidemic. And I left a quarter on my dashboard, and someone broke into my car to steal a quarter. And, you know, they left big greasy fingerprints. They clearly didn't care if they got caught. And you know, there was a CCTV camera there. And I was just like, this is a person who's making bad decisions, who doesn't have any risk reward calculus. They're by definition, right, really struggling with that stuff. And I see people who I feel like have the same kind of risk reward calculus wielding, you know, WannaCry. And I really worry, you know, like when that first wave of hospital takeovers hit, and they were like, I've got a hospital, how much should I ask for? I know, $300. I'll ask for $300 to get to give you back your hospital. And, you know, on the one hand, fine, give them the $300. But on the other hand, when people who are that kind of all over the place, you know, that kind of hot mess, are able to project power in these very random ways, it feels like it's very hard to make plans for what to do to mitigate them, because you can't really model what they might do. They're not acting in a way that's easy to predict. Maybe it's the Kim Jong-il school of cybersecurity. We have some really good questions in the chat here, and it started with Sam, who asked about aggregators and the threat of AI, and what it means when you might have highly automated attacks against users and networks, and what you see as mitigations for that as it develops.
Well, one of the nice things about automated attacks is that they are generally broadcast attacks. Are not targeted, right? So they're just looking for an opportunity, and you can frustrate a lot of those kind of attacks by just being slightly better than the rest. So, for example, if you have good compartmentalization of your services, then a compromise or a vulnerability in any one of those services doesn't expose the entire infrastructure. If you've got a patch management strategy, oh, this is the most boring end of security, that reduces the window of opportunity to a very small window, then maybe the broadcast attack doesn't hit your environment before the patch gets applied. Great. So the broadcast end of things is kind of the easier set of things to mitigate, because they're not specifically going after your organization. But there are folks who are still launching large scale attacks that are automated and still can look personal. Like a lot of the phishing attacks that can be automatically generated still look fairly convincing, right? That, oh, here is an email message, not from my company, but from one of my company's providers, and they're telling me to click on this link, and we do work with that provider. When you go to log into the site, you know, oh, well, that password didn't work. Maybe I'll try this password. How about that password? I mean, it's a natural human process, right? Like, so they can get they can be successful with a small amount of personalization. But the set of things that we're up against is it's enormous, and the tools we have to mitigate it that are most effective are the ones that have always been the most effective, which is compartmentalization and not relying on users to do something reasonable, but building processes and technologies that don't require the user to make a good choice. Like, we used to say things like, "Oh, don't click on that. You know, don't accept that expired certificate, and you know, be careful which links you click on." It's like, what? Why would you expect that folks wouldn't click on links in an hyperlinked email client, right? So either you can get rid of the links in the email client, or you can make them safer to click on. There's always some risk associated there, but now it's harder to accidentally install malware on your system than it used to be. For example, on OS 10, the operating system is able to recognize, without having installed, you know, antivirus, anti-malware, endpoint security solutions, that, you know, oh, hey, this is something that we recognize as a problem, or that it's not signed by a developer that we recognize. And so you actually have to go through a lot of steps before you can get it to execute on your machine. There are lots of these kinds of mechanisms in every sort of system, and whether you like it or not, an environment like iOS that forces apps to be downloaded from an app store means that the vector for getting software onto your machine, which is the primary way for the folks managed to install malware on their system, still has to come through the app store. So all those things make it easier for users to not accidentally put malware on their systems. But, you know, users are very creative, and we still have the reason we have ransomware as a business model is because it's successful. They've gotten more creative. So now, instead of just encrypting your data, they'll ship it off for you. They'll make their own backup for you. How convenient! And if you don't participate, then they dump your data, which is nice because you were worried about losing your data. But now everyone has a copy, so that's a different kind of problem. We're up against some sophisticated players, and we're up against some players who are not especially sophisticated, but who can get quite close to this set of folks with tools that are sophisticated and easy to execute. So the best that we can do are using the same mechanisms that have always worked for us: compartmentalization, reducing the window of opportunity, defense in depth. I'm going to vomit after saying that phrase. But those are the things that are effective, and engineering resilience from the start, so that you've got systems that don't have a single point of compromise, and that we are sufficiently isolating these different components, so that if you are exposed, you're exposed to a certain degree, but not everything, and getting to a place where you're able to get back to a known good state, so that after a compromise, you're able to recover quickly, that you're able to identify what happens, that you're able to understand how to, let's say, notify the people who are impacted, that you are able to prevent that same problem from happening again, at least in your environment. It's probably the best we can do against what is a growing attack surface in terms of complexity that we incorporate into our personal lives and our corporate deployments.
And Runa, how about you?
I completely agree with everything that Window has said. And I think the only other thing that comes to mind for me is that, just as we're talking about automated attacks and AI and new capabilities in that space, I choose to believe that we will then have the same types of capabilities on the defense side as well. And I think defense and offense will always be this like cat and mouse game and a bit of a race. But I do hope that we'll have the same tools available to us on the defense side as well.
So Ken Snyder, who I mentioned earlier, is in the Q&A, and he asks if there's a practice you could recommend to the average internet user that they could adopt to significantly increase overall security. And I'm going to use the moderator's prerogative to answer this one quickly on my own, because Ken once had to clean up after one of my breaches where I learned an important lesson that I sometimes need reminding of. I had once upgraded my phone, and it had lost a lot of its passwords, and we were running late, and I went with my wife to the coffee shop we normally went to, but the line was longer because we were a little late. So I checked Twitter in the line because she didn't want to stand with me. And then there was a message from a friend saying, "Was this you?" And it had a link. And the day before, I'd published a bunch of articles. And so I clicked on the link, and then it expanded to a Twitter login. And I was like, oh, it's gone to the browser, and it's asking me to log back into Twitter there to expand the Twitter short link or something. So I entered it. And that was when I realized I'd been phished, because I immediately got 7 more DMs from other people saying, "Was this you?" And it was a Twitter account takeover worm. And what I realized on the one hand was that I had, it was this Swiss cheese moment where there were all of these different very narrow apertures of vulnerability, and they had all just lined up. So there was a little hole that all the bad stuff could go through. We were running late. I just updated my phone. I didn't wait 5 minutes to see if 7 more messages identical to it would come through. And it was that tiny, narrow window of opportunity. And the lesson I took away was slow down, right? That when I am doing too many things at once, and then something unusual happens, don't deal with it. Like, just stop. And it because I immediately knew what had happened, but then I had to go through and do a lot of stuff. And if I had just waited 5 more minutes, I would have saved myself a day of cleaning up. So I wondered if you two had any kind of one top tip advice on those lines.
I don't want the internet user to have to be better at security. I want our technologies to make it easier for users to do completely reasonable things without having to worry that it's going to compromise their security. So I'm going to push this back to the developers. I'm going to push it back to the technology makers and say that we're the ones who have to do better, and that users should be able to just live their lives and not worry about this.
Good point. Runa?
I would say, in that case, turn on 2FA on your Twitter account.
It didn't exist back then, but now I do it. Yeah, that's like 2FA. Feels like 2FA is the thing that when you ask people about it, they all say that's the thing we should do. There was a Dutch security researcher who just claimed to have guessed Trump's password, and couldn't get, and this spurred this debate where all these sources from inside the White House say that no one can get Trump to turn on 2FA for Twitter. And that feels like a problem. I mean, again, it's not the user's business to secure themselves, but maybe if you're the president of the United States, you should have 2FA turned on your Twitter account. Just saying. The anonymous attendee asks about privacy in kids and to what extent and to what degree you can explain privacy to kids. I think it's a parenting question, but it's also like a product design question. And I have thoughts, but I'm interested in your folks' thoughts.
I have kids, but they're too young to understand all the things that I'm trying to convince my 2.5-year-old that I don't want the street level blinds to be wide open, but she really wants to sit on the windowsill and watch the world go by. And I'm like, I am not dressed yet. Can we wait, before we do this? That's a 2.5-year-old. The 7-year-old, is just starting to interact online, whether it's distance learning or it's, communicating with friends, staying in touch, since we can't go do the social things that we want to do. And it's hard to explain to adults how much of your life is exposed through the way you engage online. Everything from like your interests to your, where you live and where you go, and the folks that you engage with and who's influential in your world. And if we can barely explain it to adults, then it's, you can imagine how much more difficult it is for kids. But at least for younger folks, I try and make sure that they don't have a whole lot of vectors that they can send content out. I try to treat the internet for the most part as read-only for the younger folks. But yeah, I wonder how my position on this is going to change as we get a little bit older.
Runa, I don't know if you have kids or if you advise kids or parents on any of this stuff. Do you have any thoughts on this?
No, I don't. So I'm really curious to hear from you.
Yeah. Well, I wrote a couple of young adult novels about privacy, and so I hear a lot from kids. I have a sample bias problem, right? I hear a lot from kids who are interested in privacy because they're the ones who read Little Brother. But I take my cues from researchers who work on this, and I'm going to recommend two really good social scientists who work on how kids use networks. The first is Mimi Ito, whose full name is Mizuka Ito, Mizukaito. And her research, the last major project she did is out of date now, but in terms of understanding the way kids think about privacy, it's still very good. It's called the MacArthur Digital Youth Project. And at the time, it was the largest study ever done of how American children use the internet. And it subsumed 17 PhD dissertations of her students, including a dissertation by another researcher I'm going to recommend named Dana Boyd. And Dana wrote a really superb book about this. That is her dissertation that I think Yale University Press published as a book called "It's Complicated." That's also open access and Creative Commons. And Dana makes the point, window to your bread and butter there, that kids often want privacy, but they don't know who they need to be private from. That they overweight the importance of being private from their teachers and their parents, and they underestimate the long-term privacy consequences of a disclosure today to someone they've never met yet, right? A cop, a school administrator, a future boss, a future bully, someone who isn't even in their life yet. And that's certainly a thing that I've encountered both in writing young adult fiction and in parenting, is that kids are often capable of really first-rate reasoning, but they don't have context. And that's the process of growing up. As much as figuring out how to reason, it's learning what to reason about. And it's why there are disciplines that are self-contained where you got child prodigies like math or chess, and disciplines that have a huge contextual lift where you don't get child prodigies. There are no child prodigy historians, right? There's just too much reading to do to be the Doogie Howser of history. There's too much reading to do to be the Doogie Howser of medicine, right? The reason we don't get 12-year-old doctors is because it takes 10 years to do the reading. And what I want to do as a parent and as someone who writes stuff that kids take to heart about privacy is make sure that their mistakes are in low stakes environments. And the way that you reduce the stakes for an error is to, on the one hand, limit their exposure window, as you said, read-only internet, watching what kind of networks they use. If they get on social, which they will eventually, speaking as the father of a 12-year-old, when they're 12, they're going to be on social. Keeping them confined to commenting on friends' accounts and keeping their own accounts private except from friends is a way to reduce the stakes. But another way to reduce the stakes is to establish a rapport in which they understand that the inevitable errors that they make will not be met with punishment, but with compassion and education, right? That, my daughter, in fact, just got in trouble using social media in a way that she shouldn't have. And the remedy was slightly increased inspection by us of her social media use after talking through what she did wrong, so that we know that she's taken the lesson to heart. And once we're sure that she has, she goes back to having the degree of autonomy she had before. It wasn't a punishment, it was a corrective. And to me, that's the hard mitigation strategy. You can't keep your kids out of peril. You can reduce the consequences of the peril. And to do that, they need to be able to trust you, to come to you and say, Mom, Dad, I just did something stupid and I'm worried or nervous or scared or sad. Can you help me sort it out? And to be that line of first defense. And I see Ali back in the chat, which I think means that it's time to say goodnight. We are at the top of the hour. In fact, a little past. I know you folks have other Zoom conferences to get to. Let me, before I turn it over to Ali, say thank you. First to Window and Runa. Window, especially for getting up in the middle of the night halfway around the world. You are a trooper and a hero. I really appreciate it. And you're far more cogent in the wee hours than I could ever be. And Runa, thank you for all the service you've done, the Tor Network, the Freedom of the Press Foundation, all that other work that you do, that I rely on and use, and that the people I trust and rely on use as well. And thank you to the audience, especially those of you who've come to more than one of these. And especially those of you who came to more than one of these and use the service I set up to donate your spare copies of the book to libraries or schools or prisons or halfway houses. We still have that list. If you've got spare copies and you'd like to donate them and you want to pick one up from Third Place or any of our other booksellers, they'll send them along. And thanks finally to Third Place. Again, having a great community bookstore is a privilege and not a right. Those of you who are in the Seattle area, please support them. With your bodies, with your custom, with your affection. We are down to one major digital bookstore, one nationwide chain bookstore, and then the indies. And if we lose the indies, it's not even McDonald's and Burger King anymore. It's McDonald's and McDonald's online. And so let's keep them around.
Well, thank you. Thank you guys so much. Thanks for coming. Thanks so much for talking. I think that this stuff is so important and there's so many of us don't know we don't know. So it's been really interesting to hear what you guys all know so much about. Thank you all so much for coming out, and we'll see you guys all soon.
Thank you.
Good night. Good night.
Good night, everyone. Thanks.